Welcome guys, I'm just going to make a pretty extensive list of general strategy tips, so I won't go into depth with individual units and decks, but these are just going to be general strategy tips that you're going to use for pretty much every game. So first thing, create a deck and with a specific purpose and stick to the game plan. So you see here we've got a rush deck, everything's cheap, you're going to want to try and finish the battle as early as possible. Here we have a delay deck where everything's expensive and you're going to want to try and stall until you've got all your big units out and then finish the game in the end, in the long run. Okay, so pick the abilities at the start of the battle which match up with the strategy of your deck. So if you're playing a quick rush deck, then you're going to want either damage or manipulation. If you're playing a long game deck, then you're going to want healing and cinder or reinforce. Make use of your time. If the other player's playing their turn, then you can have a look, see how much cinder you've got, start judging what you're going to want to deploy, have a little think about where you're going to move your units to. Don't just watch what the other player's doing. So every bit of time is precious in online games, so you don't want to waste time during your turn figuring things out that you could be figuring out when it's the opponent's turn. Before you move your captain, make sure you know what you're going to deploy in that turn. You don't want to end up moving your captain and then realise that you wanted to deploy a unit somewhere which, in the new position, he now can't reach. So now I can't place the unit here where I wanted to. So always make sure you know what you want to place and where you want to place it before you move your captain. Don't just deploy a unit because you can afford to do so. So deploying Amplifier Bytol here is not going to get me any benefit.
Be brave.
So just because you can afford to deploy a unit, it doesn't mean you always want to. Sometimes it's better to wait until the next turn. Following on from that, don't just use abilities because they're ready to use. Sometimes waiting a turn is the better option. So if I moved in here and hit this snarling with corrosive particles turned on, I get 1 extra damage, where if you wait 1 turn I might be able to get 3 extra damage with Axle Pyro. Plus, this unit's stunned. On the next turn it won't be. I'll be able to get at least 1, possibly 2 shots off with rapid fire. So using it this turn, I'd only get 1 damage. Saving it a turn, I might be able to get 5 damage. Before you use abilities, make sure you know what you're going to deploy or what you can afford to deploy. Don't just use an ability because you can. So you might be tempted to just quickly see what abilities you've got and then use them. But by using an ability like here, it would prevent me from being able to get another piece on the board. So make sure before you use an ability to check if it's going to stop you from being able to deploy a unit. Some units are particularly good at countering other units. For example, poison units against high HP targets, and in particular the Makueni Thicket against armoured high HP characters. So try not to deploy them unless you really need to. Keep them in your hand, ready for when the timing is right. They've just deployed this sentinel turret. I can now destroy this turret by using the Makueni Thicket. If I had deployed this at the beginning of the game, then I might have lost this unit and not had the ability to quickly take down a target, which would have otherwise been very difficult to deal with. There are other examples like Broken Vengeance against low damage melee units. Try to not give the game away as to what your game plan is. If you have a deck which is built for long game and you don't want to get close to the enemy at the start, don't just immediately hide, because the opponent will automatically know that you've got a late game deck. So consider going towards them for a turn to make them second guess if you've got a rush deck or a long game deck. This might then make them retreat back away, second guess, or deploy units further back out of reach thinking that you're going to rush them. It could buy you the 1 or 2 turns time that you need to get out your late game deck. Same applies in reverse. If you are playing an early game deck, then you don't want to make it look like you're just rushing straight out at them. Consider just hiding behind some cover, make it look like you're hiding. The enemy will almost certainly come towards you, especially if they're playing with Extilia. You can then quickly get out your cheap units on the following turn and ambush them. Try to keep your captain in the centre of the board. This will give you the flexibility to be able to surround your enemy, being able to place units all across the board. If you were down one side or the other, you would only have a very small area to place your units. So now we're able to deploy units over here and deploy more on this side. This will then hem them in and give them nowhere to retreat to. Until you know what your enemy's abilities are, try to keep your units spread as far apart as possible. Don't clump up into a ball, otherwise you could be at risk of an orbital strike or corrosive particles. So here we can deploy Furia over this side.
Smells like tears.
Then we can move across and deploy Tipu over this side. Now we're pretty safe from any enemy abilities, and we can also start to surround the enemy so they've got nowhere to run to. Try to deploy your units behind cover on the turn you deploy them if you're not playing as Astra. You don't want them to take damage on the turn that they're deployed, so if you can't be able to protect them behind hard cover, then in the very least deploy them behind soft cover.
I'm fired up, and you're gonna be too.
Don't just finish units off when they're close to death. If you can finish a captain off on the following turn, if you do damage to them now. This is the last unit I've got left to shoot, I could destroy this turret and leave him on 5 health, or I could damage him and drop him down to 2 health and then finish him off on the next turn. If I didn't damage him and I destroyed the turret, he could drop a defense drone or an Ursix Nethervine, which could then deny me the opportunity to finish him off on the next turn. And obviously if it's late game where they're getting 9 Cinder, they could also deploy other units which might be able to kill your units on the following turn. So don't be hasty in destroying targets if you think that you might be able to finish the captain off in 2 turns. This does not apply when facing Astra, as she can deploy a unit and charge and use it on the same turn. So you could put your captain at risk by not taking out a unit that might damage you on the following turn. Be mindful that only characters with the airborne trait
Whoa, whoa, okay.
can go over obstacles, including your own and the enemy's units. So with that in mind, 1, don't block yourself in, and 2, you can use cheap units to block choke points to delay the enemy from catching you. Or you can use sleeper mines. So I could use this unit to block this area,
Who am I?
and I could use a mine to block this area.
Look at what I've got here.
That will delay the enemy from being able to go through these points until they've killed the blocking units, which can buy you time to build a bigger deck. Be careful when placing your units near cover, directly touching it, in particular along the edge of the map. It's quite easy for a single unit to be able to pin you into the edge of cover where you can't move out. So when placing units near cover, sometimes it's better to just leave them slightly further away than directly touching it, just so you've got that little bit of leeway that one unit can't pin you in. You can also pin units in with mines, so if you do see somebody touching cover, if you position a mine properly, you can actually pin a unit in just with a single mine, which will then make them have to waste a turn destroying the mine to be able to escape. This is more important when placing immobile targets. If you've got a unit near cover and you place an immobile target in front of it, you can sometimes block yourself in, and there's nothing you can do about it because the target's immobile, unless you have crankbait or chuck and co to be able to dislodge it. You'll have to wait for that unit to die before you can move the unit that you trapped in. Before moving your unit or placing a unit, hover your mouse over the enemy units to see where their movement range is. This way you can choose whether to move just outside of their range if they're a melee unit, so they can't engage you in melee. Or if they're a ranged unit, like here, we can see he can move to there, so he'll be able to shoot here. So we can deploy our unit just out of sight of that. So he could move to there and shoot here, or move to there and shoot here. So it's likely that he won't be able to hit me if I place my unit there.
So little time.
Whenever an enemy places a unit, click on that unit to see its abilities. This will then help you to understand what that unit's capable of. So here they've just placed Taurian Guardian. We can now read and see that it says that 40% harder to hit for themselves and the nearest ally. So we now know what that ability is as soon as they've placed the unit. This is more important for players who are new to the game. Try to get the upper hand in the first few turns of a game. You don't want to be in a position where you're heavily outnumbered by a lot of cheap units. So with that in mind, always add some cheap units in your deck so you can get some men out on the field and hopefully outnumber the enemy, or in the very least match them. So here we've just got Antios and Maximus,
Like my battle mask?
and because we got these out, we were able to match their Maximus and Taria.
A slap is an unreal touch.
and now we're able to knock both of their early units out with 2 of our early units. When there's a lot of pieces on the board, it can be quite easy to forget to use one of your characters, so before you hit end turn when you think you've finished, just press the shift key a few times to scroll through all of your units. You might find that you forgot to use one of them.
Fine. Revenge is here for your days. Get cozy with regret. Do my burdens have solutions?
Well, I hope that was helpful, guys. Thanks for watching, and just before I finish the video, I'll just quickly show you some of the decks that I've built, which I find that are quite competitive online. I don't know whether they're perfect, but they're quite competitive. So at the moment, Astra is just absolutely dominant between the 3 captains. So if you want to play an Astra build, then there are 3 different ones that you can go for that I've found to be particularly useful. You can either go for an early game Astra, so I'll just leave this up on the screen for a second. I won't bother going through each one of them. But basically this is designed for you to get a nice early start with some relatively cheap units. Then we've got one that's built around Tipu, so you can use Neckerwill to evacuate Tipu and restore them back to full health, and then deploy them again, and obviously you can get some pretty decent plays doing this. And then you've got some fairly cheap units to protect you while you're trying to get Tipu and Neckerwill out. And then you've got the late game Astra build, which is built around healing, defense drones, and just doing damage in the late game with the Florio Lancer crosshair. So yeah, they're the Astra builds. Then the 2 Extilia and Zax builds, they're identical, but obviously the captain changes the way you play slightly. But the build is basically lots of cheap units with Axle Pyro to do some permanent ticking damage, mainly against the enemy captain, and also an AoE attack, and Florio Lancer to do long range attacks in the late game to spend your Cinder in the late game if you don't manage to finish it early on. I put Furia in here because they do 5 damage on the turn after they deploy, so their first turn they get to do 5 damage, which is quite a lot. In the Extilia build I haven't got Furia in, instead I've got Crankbait to pull enemies into Extilia's range. Okay, so they're the main decks that I use. I've got a couple here, but they're just trial decks that I'm just messing about, mainly in AI mode, just messing about with these. So yeah, hope that's been helpful, guys. Hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you in the next one, or on the battlefield. Take care, see you soon.